Hello and welcome to Counterpoint. My name is David Clement, filling in for Tanya Granick-Allen. Erin O'Toole is out as leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, and the political world is watching for what happens next in the CPC search for a new leader. What does a leadership race even entail? What are the rules that will determine the party's next leader? Is Pierre Poilievre, who has already announced the frontrunner to lead the party into the next election? All great questions that we will dive into. Joining me to discuss the logistics of the leadership race is elections lawyer Mike Donison. Mike, thank you very much for joining me on Counterpoint.
Glad to be here, David.
Great. So right off the top, obviously O'Toole is out. The party is in search for a new leader. What happens next?
Well, what happens next, because of what the caucus did last week, there's technically a vacancy in the permanent leadership of the party. And so the party constitution kicks in, and it provides that the National Council, which is the volunteer governing body of the party, have to meet and determine to commence the process. And the most important thing they do is they have to appoint what's called a Leadership Election Organization Committee, LEOC, the acronym for that. They have to appoint the chairman, and then the Constitution says that 6 members of the National Council across the country are members automatically, 1 Conservative senator, 1 Conservative MP, and 1 member of what's called the Conservative Fund Board, the fundraising arm. Mm-hmm. But the Constitution doesn't require that be the only people. They can add other people. And then that committee has to meet, and it develops all of the detailed rules, how the election's going to be conducted.
And how long are we expecting that process to take? Because I think in everybody's mind, the race starts now, but that obviously might not be the case.
That's right. It has to officially be launched by the National Council. What the Constitution simply says is they must do it in a reasonable period of time, right? It's pretty flexible. But once they get this LEOC up and going, they'll develop rules. But the Constitution says there are some rules that LEOC must. They can do the detailed rules, but there are some things. They have to provide for postal ballot. No, so there can be other forms of voting, but there must be provision for every member to be able to get a mail-in ballot. It's 1 person, 1 vote, except it isn't. Because what they do is they assign 100 points to each riding. Mm-hmm. So there are 338 seats in the House of Commons, so there'll be 33,800 points. And the person to win must get a majority of the points, not necessarily a majority of the actual popular votes cast.
And how has that changed from this leadership election or the one prior for how those points are divided up? Is every riding 100 points regardless of how many members are in the riding?
The simple answer is yes, except there was an added provision. If for any reason a particular riding less than 100 people actually vote, like say, for instance, you got a riding and only 90 votes get cast, then they only entitled to 90 points.
Okay.
But every riding has 100 is the max. So everyone is basically equal except for a few who might have less than actually 100 people voting. But it is equal per riding.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And so generally speaking, there is equal representation per riding across the country. How do you feel that plays into whom is actually selected? Because obviously there would be ridings with thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of members. And then, like you've mentioned, there are certainly ridings with fewer members, some less than 100.
Well, I think it gives some balance. I think we are a very regionalized country, and I think the party recognizes that. So I think there's just a sense of fairness, because you could have a situation where in certain parts of the country, you could have some massive signups of people of a particular interest group. I'll just leave it at that. Mm-hmm. And that a lot of people think that would distort the result. So I think the other idea is whoever wins the leadership has obviously not got a concentrated vote in only a select number of ridings. The ultimate winner has had substantial support in every single constituency mm-hmm. across the country.
Yeah, and we have about 30 seconds before we go to commercial, but I can only assume that electorally for the general election would have some benefit.
Some what, sorry?
I can only assume that distribution or that broad support would have some electoral benefit in the general election.
Yes, it would.
Of course. Okay. Well, we will be back momentarily. I also want to chat with you about how we got here in the first place, how the Reform Act played a role in what has happened to Mr. O'Toole. And we'll be right back after the break. Welcome back to Counterpoint. I'm David Clement. I am joined by elections lawyer Mike Donison. I think the big question here logistically is how we got here. In part, the Reform Act, which was a piece of legislation championed by Conservative Michael Chong. From your view, how does the Reform Act create a process like this, or how important is the Reform Act in ousting a leader or forcing this type of fundamental change?
Well, I think that the Reform Act, which, by the way, is incorporated into an act of the Parliament of Canada called the Parliament of Canada Act, I think it's made a really big change. I'm not quite sure the Conservative caucus realized what they did by adopting it. It's their first caucus to do it, because for the last more than 100 years, the two major parties have moved to a system of the leader being selected from outside the caucus, in the sense that it's a vote of the entire membership. And of course, what that has meant is the party leader is a lot more powerful vis-a-vis the caucus, because he or she can always say, well, I have the support of the party in the country, not just the MPs. And this has shifted the balance significantly, if they want to use it, in favor of the caucus. It's pretty brutal. I mean, Mr. O'Toole woke up one morning and he was living in Stornoway and leader of Her Majesty's Opposition. And by the time he went to bed, he was no longer leader of the party or leader of Her Majesty's Opposition.
Yeah, it feels a little, for anyone who follows UK politics, it feels a little more similar to their system, where very quickly a leader can be ousted. But it's my understanding that the Conservatives are the only party who've actually formally adopted the Reform Act. Is that correct?
That is correct. All the other caucuses, what the Act says at the beginning of each parliamentary caucus is supposed to vote on whether they want to adopt any of the provisions of the reform bill to apply to them. And my understanding is none of the other parties have ever had any of it apply to them. The Conservatives, I think, allowed it to apply in terms of election of the caucus chair and some other matters, but this is the first parliament where they've elected to have the Chong rules apply to the leadership issue as well. Yes.
And so it seems like we're balancing here the power of caucus and the power of members. What is your take in regards to how the Conservatives have adopted this? Is this something, from a party perspective, is this beneficial to the party? And then is it beneficial for Canada? Is this something that other parties should follow suit with?
Well, I personally am in favor of it. Some of my colleagues in the Conservative Party may not. I think it's a useful function because, quite frankly, if a party leader cannot get significant support of his caucus on an ongoing basis, it becomes pretty dysfunctional. So this is I think it's an important lever to get the pressure off in a difficult situation, because otherwise you're faced with the difficult process of cumbersome process and lengthy process of the party constitution, right? Which only allows a leadership vote to occur, or even a review, at the next party convention. And the next convention of the Conservative Party isn't scheduled to the fall of 2023.
Yeah. And
so I'm in favor of it. I think it's a useful pressure. And the fact that the Conservatives have now used it, this is important in our system. They've now set a precedent, right? It's like everything else. Once you start using something, then you keep using it. So, but I'm in favor of it. I think it's a good balance between caucus. I think we need to restore some relevance to Parliament and to parliamentary caucuses. So I'm in favor of it. I think Mr. Chong's bill is a good idea.
And what would you say to critics who maybe feel that some of this was led by caucus members who are in what are considered forever seats or safe seats, and that maybe this isn't in the best interest of the party and that isn't represented in their actions because they're going to win re-election pretty much regardless?
Well, I suppose it could cut both ways. That's true. But remember, of course, it does require at least 24 must stick their head up above the parapet. It's a pretty dangerous process. And in this case, they actually got 35. So when you've got 1/3 of your caucus willing to go public, willing to take the chance, that indicates a serious problem with your caucus and the leader's relationship with it. So, that may be the issue now, but sometime in the future, there will be different party divisions and unhappiness with a different leader for from different groups. So,
and do you think that maybe from the leader's office that this will encourage maybe more active listening in regards to the concerns of their colleagues?
I certainly hope so. Yes, I think it will. I think this will be a real lesson to party leaders that they have to listen, because there were some instances of Mr. O'Toole really didn't consult his caucus, and public announcements were made, and even the front bencher critic wasn't. And I don't want to try to be too critical of Mr. O'Toole, because all leaders tend to do this, but I think that caused him a problem. And I think maybe in the future, leaders will be a little less inclined to govern that way.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. We really appreciate it. Welcome back to Counterpoint. I'm David Clement. I am now joined by Zahra Sultani, Director at Loyalist Public Affairs, and Michael Diamond, Principal of the Upstream Group. Thank you both for joining me on Counterpoint.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So, I mean, just to start off, it's been a monumental week for the Conservative Party. I'll start with you, Michael. What went wrong for Erin O'Toole?
Look, I think what went wrong for Erin O'Toole was from the moment he pivoted away from being the true blue candidate for leader and then losing an election as, frankly, a moderate red Tory. It was a strategy that made it, he had to win the last election to avoid facing the membership of the Conservative Party of Canada at some point. He really soured himself with that base and with that electorate, and I think a convention vote was going to be very difficult for him. And when he refused to make any changes, be it personnel or strategy changes, right after the last election, I think it was a sign that he wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to revert to that true blue person that the Conservative Party members elected very impressively in 2020, and that it was going to be up to caucus to really deal with it. And I think that's what we ultimately saw last week when they took it upon themselves to end his leadership.
So, Zahra, I think Michael has, politely described it as a pivot. Many would describe it as a flip-flop. Do you feel that part of O'Toole's undoing was in some sense a lack of authenticity, or for voters across the country and even Conservatives really knowing what he stood for?
It was, and I think what I agree with you that most would describe it as a flip-flop. You know, he ran for leadership in a completely different tone, and he had a completely different narrative, and that's what the members of the Conservative Party voted for. But as soon as he became leader, and during the campaign, we saw a much more softer and much more center-left kind of candidate and the campaign. So I think probably it is my personal opinion that the real Erin was the Erin that ran for leadership. But, campaigns do matter, advisors matter. And I think what we saw was probably a bunch of not very helpful strategies and advices that led to him really losing his voice and losing sort of his way in terms of what a conservative leader should stand for and should be about.
And so, Michael, for what a conservative leader should stand for, from your view, do you feel that this is an exciting time for the party to maybe re-examine what that means, what it means to be a conservative in today's age?
Absolutely. And I think that's both from a partisan internal political perspective, but also from a public policy perspective, that the disdain that Erin O'Toole held the Conservative Party membership in, where he flip-flopped on a carbon tax, which was voted upon at last year's convention, that we'd maintain our traditional opposition to it, for example, to his flip-flops on guns, to his refusal to meet the membership at a annual general meeting to have a expedited leadership review. I think we now have an opportunity to really elect someone from the grassroots. And I think, obviously there's one very prominent candidate who's already out there with over 1 million views on Instagram and over 2 million views on Twitter with Pierre Poilievre. I think it's really quite amazing what he's been able to do by just being a very plain-spoken, no-nonsense conservative who isn't going to back down because media push against him, isn't going to back down because he wants to be acceptable at liberal cocktail parties. And really, I think for conservatives, he'll stand up for what it means to be a Conservative Party member, but also present Canadians with a conservative vision for the country, which will definitely resonate with members come voting time.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point about Pierre Poilievre. That's certainly the impression from partisans. I'll go generally for you, Zahra. What do you think the general public is going to feel in regards to Pierre Poilievre's approach to politics? Because it certainly is something different than what we're used to.
Yeah, I think his personal style, being considered a bit more edgy, more frank, I think that's something that the general public appreciates, and that's probably why there's been so much interest in him announcing that he's running for leader. I think there is an advantage and there's disadvantages to that as well. I think he's been able to pose himself as a what we call the real blunt conservative that will fight for you, that will fight for the little guy. But with that comes certain hesitations in different parts of the party.
Welcome back to Counterpoint. Zahra, before we cut to break, you were talking about the balance of appealing to conservative members while also having to bear in mind the sensibilities of the general electorate. How do you feel, if you could elaborate on how you feel Pierre Poilievre's approach can toe that line?
Look, I think it's a great thing that he's been able to get his messaging out in a very real, authentic way. And that's what really people in this, certainly in the conservative movement, that's what people crave. But I think there is, I think his challenge is to come over this narrative that this kind of tone may not win the general election. And I think that is something that may hurt his, reaching out to certain parts of the party, because there is that narrative is already out, and there are a lot of people who are saying this is not going to fly with the average Canadian when the general election comes up. So that's something that he has to work on and gain the members' confidence. I think that this is, this is how I'm going to, have a plan that on how he's going to reach out to average Canadians and also show that he is, in fact, going to be able to win an election.
And so, Michael, obviously right now he is the only declared candidate. Are we looking at a coronation, or are there going to be other contenders to put their name forward where we have a contested leadership race like we've had the past two rounds?
Look, I mean, even a contested race wouldn't prohibit a virtual coronation in this matter. I think Pierre is incredibly strong, incredibly organized, has great reach across the country in surprising pockets, and a good personal story to match that. But, this is there's a lot of calculations why one would run for the leadership of a political party. Leslyn Lewis last time came out of virtually nowhere. A friend of mine, and many within the party knew her, but she wasn't a high-profile public figure in Canada, and running really gave her that platform. So there's certainly benefit for people to take a rider and run a long shot campaign, and that if they enter it thinking that victory for them is not necessarily being the victor when the ballots are counted, there can be a great deal of benefit. I mean, in terms of Pierre and his ability to reach out to the country, one thing I've been shocked by since he posted his video on Saturday night is just saying people, friends of mine, people in my personal network, well from outside of partisan politics, who are sharing it and seem excited. And, if you look at the issues, he's really been one of the few people talking about, be it inflation, supply chain, just getting the country back to work. I think that's going to resonate well beyond conservative circles. And if we look, the last election, we ran on a deplorable platform. We ran as liberal light, and we got fewer votes and fewer seats than we did under Andrew Scheer. Yeah. So I think a strong contrast instead of an echo of the Liberals, which Pierre would undoubtedly offer, would really be beneficial.
And so, Zahra, do you think it's time for whether it's Pierre or otherwise, or any other candidate, for Conservatives to maybe take the fight to the Liberals rather than campaigning on their heels, which is a common critique of the party, both under Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Pierre, with what he's sort of put forth so far, I think he's the guy that would actually be able to advocate for conservative values on a lot of issues that the Conservatives are concerned about, whether it's inflation, whether it's COVID restrictions, whether it's the economy, carbon tax, etc.
And
the one thing,
real quick, do you feel that some of that message is resonating with millennials? Because a lot of commentators have been talking about how millennials will be more of a deciding factor, and that Pierre may actually play a pretty active role in courting some of those votes.
I think more so in a general election, I believe so. And I think given some of the studies that has been done in the past 2 years of the pandemic, related to the economy and related to a lot of other issues, I think millennials have really felt the bigger impact of the lockdowns in the past 2 years. Yeah. And I think a conservative voice would actually, I think they're more open to hear from a conservative now than, let's say, they were 3 years ago.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we are out of time. Thank you both very much for joining me on Counterpoint. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.